All right, so as I said a moment ago, my name is Dave Walker. I'm the Assistant Director and Transportation Program Manager here at the Rockingham Planning Commission. We're here today to talk about the Seacoast Transportation Corridor Vulnerability Assessment and go through an overview of the project and the findings now that we're nearing its completion. So the agenda for today's talk is I'm going to spend about 45 minutes or so going through overview of methodology, the network analysis that we worked on, the two case studies that we included, and then covering some of the basic findings and recommendations of the study, and then finishing up talking about next steps. So first, getting into the overview of methodology. So this project was funded by 2019 NOAA Project of Special Merit that was through the New Hampshire Coastal Program. We also supplemented it using our federal transportation planning funds that we have here at RPC. The project is a partnership between the Seacoast communities, the RPC, the Coastal Program, the Department of Transportation, and UNH. The goal of this project, or multiple goals of this project, were to assess the impacts of projected sea level rise on the transportation network at the 1 foot, 1.7 foot, 4 foot, and 6.3 foot sea level rise scenarios. And in doing so, to evaluate the changes in traffic volume and traffic patterns, impacts on road capacity and conditions, and that sort of thing related to the sea level rise. We wanted to be able to prioritize and identify the sites that were impacted by flooding for further evaluation, identify adaptation and resilience strategies for those priority sites. And then one of our ultimate goals was to improve our decision-making process and how we determine which transportation projects to take on. So just a high-level overview of this is we rely a lot on previous work that's been done, such as the Tides to Storms project, the Coastal Risks and Hazards Commission work, and the science that surrounds all of that. We identified sites on the regional network, particularly sites that are on the regional travel demand model network, and estimated impacts at those sites. We prioritize those locations for the vulnerability assessment component of the study. We then conducted the individual site assessments and site visits and looking at specific conditions at the locations and working on the case studies from that point. We conducted a network analysis using our travel demand model to determine how the road system reacted to closures, and then developed adaptation options to fit them all together. So first, talking about how we identified and prioritized the roadways. We started out, like I said, using the work of the Tides to Storm study, the Coastal Risks and Hazard Commission, and basing it on the science from the New Hampshire Science Summary, the Coastal Flood Risk Guidance. So we overlaid that with our travel demand model, which looks at regional travel patterns based on where people live and work around a region. And that network from the regional travel demand model includes all the state roadways, as well as many, but not all of the local roadways. So there are a number of local roads, particularly neighborhood streets, things like that are not included in the model at all. But from those two things, we could determine what the impacts of sea level rise were on the transportation network. So the map on this page shows the travel demand model links and the impacts of sea level rise at the 4 foot scenario. So that's the light pink. So if we took that previous work in the regional travel demand model, and you can kind of split that into two kind of parallel efforts. First being looking at the direct transportation network impacts. So this is looking at the specific sites that were inundated, what model links were inundated, were they isolating, if there was flooding, was it isolating particular neighborhoods or developments or particular parts of the coast? What are the impacts of the flooding on the particular infrastructure at the site? So how does that damage the pavement? What does that mean? That kind of thing. So from that, we developed the site vulnerability assessments. sort of in parallel to that, we looked at the transportation network impacts. So we looked at what are the traffic pattern changes that were occurring, how did the volume on a particular roadway change based on it being closed due to inundation, or another parallel route being closed due to inundation, that kind of thing. And so we looked at the impacts on capacity and potential condition of the roads that were remaining at that point. So that's our network analysis. So talking more specifically about the network analysis and the case studies, I'll go into sort of some of the outputs from those. So talking about the network analysis first. So here on the screen, you're seeing the identified impacted locations on the travel demand model network at each sea level rise scenario. Starting on the left with the 1 foot sea level rise, we have 3 sites. 2 of them are in Hampton, 1 in Rye. At 1.7 feet of sea level rise, that increases to 4 sites, 3 of which are in Rye, and 1 again 3 in Hampton and 1 in Rye. At 4 feet of sea level rise, our number expands out to 25 locations, and almost all the coastal communities are impacted at this point, with sites in Seabrook, Hampton, Northampton, Rye, Newcastle, Portsmouth, and then we've moved inland as well to the Great Bay communities, where there's a site in Stratham and in Exeter that are impacted. At the 6.3 feet of sea level rise, we expand from 25 sites to 52 sites, and as you can see from the map, essentially a lot of those locations identified at 4 feet tend to blend together at this point, and so there's a significant impact on the coast. As well as we're seeing more sites moving inland as well, around the region. So when we look at the impacts on the travel demand model network and the transportation network, we're trying to determine, if you close a particular roadway, what happens around it? How does the traffic react to that closure? What alternate routes are taken? That sort of thing. At the 1 foot sea level rise scenario, which is on the left side of the screen, you can see that where we have the 3 locations that are impacted, we have essentially the Highland Avenue 101 access to Route 1A in Hampton Beach. We have High Street in Hampton Beach that's impacted as well. And then Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd up in Rye. And so around the Marsh Rd, Parsons Rd area, you can see that we have some localized changes in the traffic pattern, where traffic is, instead of using Marsh Rd and Brackett Road, is kind of moving along what's Wallace Road and the middle section of Brackett Road, and some of the other side roads around through there. So it's kind of localized right around that spot of inundation. And particular on all 3 of these maps here, areas, the roads that are gaining traffic are shifted towards orange or red color, whereas those roads that are losing traffic are shifted towards a blue or dark blue color. And when we look down in Hampton, where we have the 2 sites, we see a little more of a larger sort of area that's impacted, where there's less traffic coming in to Hampton Beach via 101 and via High Street, and it's moving along and shifting over towards Winnacunnet Road and North Shore Drive, Cusack Road, and those kind of side roads up on the northern part of Hampton. At 1.7 feet, we start to see the first sort of regional impacts and regional shifts in traffic patterns from the closures along the coast. We see the first time we see traffic shifting from the Hampton approaches to Hampton Beach to the Seabrook approach. So we see a pretty significant jump in traffic on the southern part of Route 1 and Route 286 down here in Seabrook. We see further disruption of traffic in Hampton with more focus on Winnacunnet Road and the other side roads, such as North Shore Drive or North Shore Road. And then we see some disruptions along Route 1A in sort of a larger sense than what we were seeing at 1 feet. And that's due to essentially the closures of some of these entrances are shifting the pattern along Route 1A as well. And as we move further north into the Rye, we see that same sort of area of disruption around Odiorn Point and Marsh Rd, Parsons Rd, and we see that same sort of pattern of traffic moving around that disruption using some of the other roads in that area. But we're also seeing in sort of the center of Rye and down into Northampton, we're starting to see some, I think, results of the two impacts together, kind of pushing some of the traffic further south into Central Rye along Lang Road and Central Road in that area, and also pushing it north from Hampton into Northampton and Rye in that direction. At 4 feet of sea level rise, we see very much widespread impacts all along the coastal network here. And remember, all these blue shifted roads are roads that are seeing either reduced to zero traffic or near zero traffic. And so everything is kind of pushed inland. And so you see like things like Woodland Road here between Hampton, Northampton, and Rye seeing a huge increase in traffic as it's become the sort of the default alternate route to Route 1A along the coast. And we see similar, a similar pattern in other those parallel roads as well. Parts of Brackett Road see large increases in traffic, as do Sagamore Road and that kind of thing. This is where we also start to see impacts on Route 1. So there's a site here in the Hampton Seabrook Estuary that's impacted in Route 1. And so traffic is routing around it on Route 88 in Hampton Falls through Brown Road and Toll Farm Road to Route 27 to back to Route 1 in Hampton. There's also a significant shift in that area of some of that traffic moving it back to I-95. There's a second spot at 4 feet that's impacted on Route 1 as well, and it's up here in Portsmouth where Route 1 crosses Sagamore Creek. And the model pushes all that traffic onto Greenleaf Drive and Peverly Hill Road and Banfield Road to move around those closures. This is also where we see the first large impacts to the city of Portsmouth in terms of some of those downtown streets. State Street, Marcy Street, Newcastle Avenue are all seeing impacts. And Route 1B as a whole, there are 4 spots on Route 1B that are impacted, and essentially it eliminates access to Newcastle Island by car. Moving inland, there's 2 sites. There's one site in Exeter on Water Street near the Swayze Parkway that's impacted, that has some minor disruption of traffic. It's not a heavily traveled road through there, so it's not a big disruption. But more so here, Squamscott Road between, my apologies, Squamscott Road between Route 33 and Route 108. Is closed, which pushes more traffic through the Stratum Circle and changes the dynamics of road in that way. So just to kind of summarize what we're seeing at those different areas, sea level rise impacts. So 1 foot, we see 3 sites impacted. We're disrupting roughly 10,000 vehicles a day trips or volume wise. So mostly that's around Marsh Road and Rye and High Street and Highland Avenue in Hampton. And we see sort of shifts to adjacent streets next to them. At 1.7 feet, our amount of traffic that we're disrupting is about double what we were seeing at 1 foot. So about 20,000 trips a day. We get some more extensive flooding at some of these sites where we, under the 1 foot scenario, so Marsh Road flooding extends out to Parsons Road, and we continue to see that same sort of shift in traffic in that area. Highland Avenue, the flooding expands in that area to incorporate part of Brown Avenue and Church Street, which really limits direct access and egress at Hampton Beach through that route. Technically, Island Path would still be available as a route to get between 101 and Ashworth Avenue. That was not included in our model, so it's a little harder to determine exactly the impacts of that. But primarily at that point, we're seeing a shift in traffic to Winnicott Road and Route 286 down in Seabrook. And then the newest spot that's impacted at the 1.7 level is North Shore Road. Or Cusack Road in Hampton, which shifts more traffic onto North Shore Road. At 4 feet, again, we're expanding out to 25 sites, and the amount of disrupted traffic expands, exponentially at this point. So we're thinking about 108,000 trips a day are disrupted in some way, and that they have to determine a different route than what is maybe the ideal for where they want to go. We start to see the impacts to both north-south travel as well as east-west travel. So we have about 10 spots on Route 1A and 2 locations on Route 1 that are impacted. We have 0 access to Newcastle Island by road. We see, again, as I stated earlier, impacts to the city streets around South Mill Pond. Importantly, for Hampton Beach access, Winnacunnet Road is facing inundation at this point, as is Route 286 and Seabrook. And so there's very few paths left to the Seacoast at this point. So moving along to the case studies that we looked at, just kind of quick overview of how we did that. We based everything on the coastal flood risk guidance, in that we first established a tolerance for flood risk on the coast, or for each site. And then we applied expected level of sea level rise to that based on that tolerance for flood risk. And then from that, we developed adaptation options. So in prioritizing sites for evaluation, we focused on the 25 locations that were identified at the 4-foot scenario, so that we could be consistent with the travel demand model outputs. And so we prioritized sites based on 3 pieces. We looked at operational impacts, how much traffic per day were the roads carrying, what's the functional classification of that road, is it an arterial, is it a local street, that kind of thing. We looked at impacts on safety. So does this link provide access to emergency services, and are there alternate routes available if that particular link was closed? Then we looked at some socioeconomic factors as well. So we looked at the social vulnerability index, which looks at the a percentage of folks in a particular area that are maybe on the lower income end of the spectrum, or have mobility issues, or elderly, or lots of children, that kind of thing. People who might face more difficulties moving themselves out of the areas of inundation. We also looked at access to community facilities. So did the road provide access to the school or the town facilities or things like that? And then finally, we looked at average land value per acre to sort of round that all out. So those all together gave us our criticality, which is how we determined which sites just how we started to determine how sites were prioritized. So based on that initial assessment of prioritization that we got from those factors that I just discussed, we had discussions with the coastal program and the Department of Transportation about what priorities they might see along the corridors, and came up with the following, based on that conversation, adjusted our site selection, and came up with the sites listed here as the priority sites for evaluation. So there were actually 11 sites chosen in the end. And technically one of those sites is actually made up of 3 different locations along Route 1B in Newcastle and Rye. So, and then the 2 sites that are highlighted in orange here, and one in Rye at the Marsh Rd, Parsons Rd, and Route 1 in Hampton, are the sites that we did the more detailed scenario analysis on. So once we had identified the sites, we needed to consider which types of actions were going to be considered for each location. So those types of actions run the range of doing nothing, so no action at all, to actively moving assets out of the areas that were likely to be inundated. And in between that, we have avoiding the impacts of sea level rise. So basically prioritizing investment that's out of the water's way. working to accommodate sea level rise. So that allows us to work with the water and allow both to coexist essentially. And then options to resist inundation. So things like seawalls and like that will keep the water away from the transportation network. So based on that set of types of actions that we could do, when we combine that with the level of risk that we're seeing for coastal flooding on the transportation network and the tolerance for flood risk of the transportation network, we can determine sort of which types of actions are the best fit for our area. And given that all of the sites that we've identified are at a relatively high risk of coastal flooding, and that we made a determination that the tolerance for flood risk of the roadway system is probably low to very low, as you do want the roadway network to be available and operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year. So that high need for availability kind of pushes it towards being not very tolerant at all for flood risk. So with those two things, we kind of focused our responses on the avoid and resist, and a little bit of relocate in some cases. So those are where we kind of focused our options. So when you put all of that together, you can come up with sort of a time frame, because the tolerance for flood risk, assuming a very low tolerance for flood risk, we can then, using the coastal flood risk guidance, come up with a time frame for expected levels of inundation. And so based on that, we can put this kind of information together, which looks at all the 25 sites that we have identified at the 4 foot or at up to 4 feet of sea level rise, and we can get a time frame for when we might expect to see impacts of water being on the road and when the road might actually be closed due to inundation. And this chart is attempting to sort of convey that information, where we have long periods or short periods of time here where the road is open in blue, and the dashed line is then periods of time where we would expect to potentially see impacts on the road, even if it's not fully closed due to sea level rise, that we might see some occasional inundation or storm surge pushing water up over the road, that kind of thing, king tides impacting the road, that sort of thing. And then with the barrier here at the end, that's when the roadway is assumed to be closed because it's reached that sea level rise threshold in which it is completely impacted. And you can see that out of the 25 sites, we have those that are impacted earlier on, such as Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd and Rye, the New Hampshire 101 Brown Avenue area in Hampton, which are impacted much earlier than some of the other roads along the way. And so this helps us sort of gives us, again, a little bit of prioritization. I'm going to talk next a little bit about the couple of the sites in particular, particularly the 2 locations I mentioned earlier, Marsh Rd, Parsons Rd, and Rye, as well as Lafayette Road in Hampton. So in terms of talking about Marsh Rd here, I'm going to talk about it sort of in 2 components. And we took a sort of a systems approach to this, and looking at the bigger area around Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd when considering the different options. So at 1.7 feet of sea level rise, we have impacts just on Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd in the area. So we have 3 sites that are inundated. One here on Parsons Rd near where it intersects with Brackett Road. We have it on Marsh Rd down here near the between Parsons Rd and and Route 1A here, and this is Wallace Sands State Park right there to the south. And then there's also another site of potential inundation here along the eastern part of Parsons Rd that might impact. So in that case, this small area in the center of Parsons Rd would likely be potentially isolated due to sea level rise in that case. But all the other roads right around here are open and operating. And so we looked at some options for adaptation where we could accommodate the road, accommodate the water a little bit better. So we looked at rebuilding the road with materials that are more resilient to being saturated with water. And you could, including adding on pavement to improve the ability to structurally carry traffic under those higher saturation conditions. Another option at that point to accommodate the water is simply to close the road during times of periods of high water and reroute people around it. The resist option in this case is you could do basically two approaches. One is raising Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd, essentially creating a causeway, more of a causeway through that area. So it's high enough to keep it out of the water. Alternative would be to construct berms along each side of the road to protect the roadway from the water itself. That tends to have impacts, though, on adjacent properties, as the water has to go somewhere, and those berms tend to just push it to different locations. There also might be, either from raising the road or from putting in berms, you would have impacts to the wetlands in that area, which have to be considered. A third sort of set of options at this point is to essentially abandon Marsh Rd, which you could do without having much impact on the houses in the area. This southern section of the road there's no houses on that directly except at either end, which could be accessed via Route 1A or from Parsons Rd. But you could probably not, you wouldn't be able to abandon all of Parsons Rd because there are a significant number of houses on it that would be isolated. So when you move to 4 feet of sea level rise, though, the picture in the area changes quite a bit. In addition to the 3 sites along Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd that are impacted, we also see inundation potentially on Route 1A near Wallace Sand State Park. We see it inundation potentially in this area on the southern end of Odiorn Point, and also on the northern end of Odiorn Point near the boat launch and the bridge in that area. So we see a pretty big change and shift, and suddenly Route 1A through this area is not available as well. And so the option comes back to that, is it possible that keeping Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd open might be a better alternative than keeping Route 1A open, or a more feasible alternative, I should say. So in this case, we might consider bridging or a higher causeway on Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd to make sure that that roadway stays open under all sea level rise conditions. Potentially, you could also do some culvert redesign and expansion to improve the water flow in that area and keep it draining more quickly. But there are some limitations to that it would probably not be able to do enough to keep the water off the road. In this case, when we talk about detours in this area and closures, we might consider closing 1A and opening and keeping Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd open to use that to bracket to continue to act as an alternate route to Route 1A in this case, because it might be simpler to keep those 2 roads open. So, and again, the resist and resist adaptation options are similar to what we saw under the 1.7 foot, raising the road, improving the pavement structure, constructing berms. Those create this, same types of impacts and benefits as we would see under the 1.7 scenario. And then the retreat relocate option is, like I said, abandoning a portion of Route 1A due to the challenges of trying to keep it open, particularly I think in this area along the seawalls here on the revetments, where the road is not only facing pressure from the ocean side and the tides and the waves, but also from the marsh side as well. So you're really pinching that portion of the road between the 2 pieces of water. So when we switch to talk about Route 1 and Lafayette Road in Hampton Beach, which is already occasionally experiencing flooding during king tide conditions and storm conditions, the process is a little bit simpler. It's a little more straightforward, given the importance of Route 1 to the regional transportation network, it's fairly critical that that road stay open and operating. And so when we're talking about accommodating the road, accommodating the water around the road, we have some maybe more direct options that we can consider here, and that maybe are more feasible on this higher level road here. So initially, similar to Marsh Rd, where we can reconstruct with materials that are more or less, I should say, less susceptible to changes in moisture levels, to make sure that until the water is over the road, that it can structurally handle traffic. And that's doing things like I stated before, using some different underlaying materials and increasing the thickness of the pavement on the top of the road can help keep that structure together, even if the substructure is fully inundated. In this case, on Route 1, building a causeway or expanding the existing bridge and water flow underneath Route 1 might actually allow for some improved tidal flow and reduce the amount of flooding that we see in that area. And so that is a viable option. This is about, I want to say, several thousand foot stretch of Route 1 in this location that's very low to the marsh. And so it would be a fairly extensive process to raise that road and or bridge it. Given the impacts of a detour in that Route 1 carries in this area between 20 and 25,000 cars a day, detouring that much traffic is a challenge. As we saw from the earlier network analysis maps, that traffic is pushed onto some back roads in Hampton Falls and Hamptons, which aren't designed to handle that volume of traffic. And it does push some of the traffic to I-95, which is designed for that sort of traffic, but it is not the most direct route for many people. So, in the end, either setting up temporary detours or permanent detours around this site is not ideal and not desired. So I wanted to move on to the findings and recommendations from the study. I'm going to just sort of touch on them sort of at a pretty high level and go from there. So overall findings are that, our transportation system that we have here in the Seacoast, it has enough redundancy and flexibility to work relatively well up until about 2 feet of sea level rise. After that, things start to break down pretty quickly. And by 4 feet of sea level rise, we're seeing major impacts to travel on the coast. And as sort of stated in different points along in this discussion, we see those impacts and visually in a couple of different ways. In the number of closed roadway segments, going from 3 at 1 foot to 52 at 6 feet, that's a major shift. When we talk about north, south, and east, west travel, when we start out here at current conditions, we have 3 north-south routes, essentially, I-95, Route 1, and Route 1A, but we have 22 potential east-west paths to get between 95 and 1A and the coast. So there are a lot of options. There's a lot of redundancy. But as we pass through the various sea level rise scenarios, we start to see those options and that redundancy start to disappear. So at 1 foot, we still have 3 north-south routes available, but we're down to 20 east-west routes. At 1.7 feet, again, we still have the 3 north-south routes, but we're down to 18 east-west routes that are available. At 4 feet, we see a really significant drop in both north-south and east-west travel availability, where we've gone to 1 uninterrupted north-south route, and that's essentially I-95. And we're down to 7 uninterrupted east-west routes that are available. And none of them are for the most part, the major roads that are used currently in and out of the Seacoast. At 6.3 feet, we see that drop further, and we're down to, we still have the 1 potentially north-south route that's available, that's uninterrupted, I-95, although there is some indications that near the Taylor River Dam and Taylor River Bridge there, just south of the toll system, that it might be impacted in that area. But we're down to 2 east-west routes. and I'll touch on these next. But on the actual disrupted daily volume, we see that big shift as well from that sort of localized disruption around the two or three sites early on that are closed to the very much limited coastal access. And I usually mentioned this earlier in the presentation, but the reason that you're not seeing any 6.3 foot network impact maps is because our travel demand model would not operate with the level of disruption in the network at 6.3 feet. And while that's not the ideal situation, certainly from a practical or a modeling standpoint, it does probably lend itself to describing how well the system would operate, in that it's not going to operate at 6.3 feet. There's just too much disruption. So speaking about those east-west route availability, those are sort of cataloged here down the left side of your screen, and trying to sort of convey in this chart that we start to see the disruption in those routes early on. We have Marsh Rd and Parsons Rd being disrupted early on. We have the Cusack Road and High Street and Highland Avenue, Church Street, and Brown Ave in Hampton that are all disrupted early on. And so the solid blue lines here represent an open road. The stripe, the kind of blue striped block represents an approximate transition point to a period of time where there's potential disruption on that road due to water at certain times of the day, or even only during particularly high water periods, that kind of thing. And then with the red block, that's intended to be the point at which the road is likely closed due to sea level rise. So we can see that as we approach higher levels of sea level rise, we start to see more and more of these roadways disrupted by inundation. So by the point that we're at 4 feet, we've got a few roads that are still fully available and a few other roads that are potentially entering the period of where they could potentially be disrupted by particular periods of high water. The only roads that make all the way through our 6.3 foot scenario and are still sort of potentially fully available and operating are Atlantic Ave or Route 111 in Northampton and South Road and Rye. Everywhere else we're seeing potentially has some interruptions or are fully inundated with water from sea level rise. So that's sort of trying to illustrate that major shift in a route availability over time. So looking at some more of the big picture findings that we're seeing from this study is, first off, it's follow the science. Our understanding of the impacts of climate change is constantly changing and getting more and more refined with each further study that's completed. And there's some ongoing work that will probably change our understanding of the location and the scale of sea level rise impacts on the transportation network in the coast. Particularly, the state is undertaking the development of a hydrodynamic flood risk model. The current model that we're using is known as a bathtub model, where we essentially raise the elevation of the existing sea level to a certain, to whatever scenario that we're looking at, and we look at where the water is interacting with locations that were previously dry. That does not take into account wave action or currents or wind action, that kind of thing. The coastal flood risk model will, when it's completed in about 1.5 to 2 years, will incorporate all of those kind of aspects. And that will likely change the areas that we perceive as likely to be inundated. A second piece is a study that UNH is undertaking right now on discussing pavement resilience to sea level rise. This will improve our understanding of how we can maybe improve the existing transportation network to be more resistant in the near term by improving the pavements and the substructures in the roads. We're also using this study to expand our travel demand model to cover more local roads and be able to do a more complete analysis of the impacts of detours and closures and that kind of thing. Going back to some of the discussions I had earlier, we want to make sure that we're using a systems approach going forward. And I think this project has made it very clear that you can't just close a road in one community and not expect the ripple effects. And the more significant the road, the larger those ripple effects. And so we need to start thinking about the impacts beyond individual community borders and potentially even beyond our region. And when we're talking about shifts due to climate change, and going the other direction, we're seeing that as the major routes in the coast are impacted, we see traffic shifting to what are currently neighborhood streets and smaller roads like Marsh Rd and Hampton, and that changes how people exist in those communities and how people move around, and it just needs to be looked at from the big picture perspective. And so each site needs to be looked at as the impacts on the network, not just at the impacts at the particular location. It's going to be important going forward that we're responsive to changing conditions. As we've gone through this, we're understanding that there are measures that may work in the short term, such as improving the structural capacity of the roadway to handle subsurface saturation, that will buy some time, but they don't solve the problem and they don't keep the road open and viable long term. So as soon as the water is over the road, those pavement improvements that you're making don't help you at all. So we need to just keep in mind that the solution may change over time as we get to higher levels of sea level rise. And the other piece of this that we need to be considerate of is sort of the flip of that, is that what may appear to be a good solution at the beginning and may not actually be feasible or cost effective once the engineering starts. There may be subsurface soil or water conditions that render a particular solution not viable, that kind of thing. So we just have to keep those things in mind as we go forward and be flexible in our response. And I think a key to this will be also using all the tools that we have. Not all of these impacts can be addressed by transportation projects. I think particularly Hampton Beach area and the city streets in Portsmouth, those have to be larger sort of public works that address water getting onto the land or accommodating that in some way prior to it getting to the streets. And so we need to take a sort of very broad brush approach to those and not just focus only on transportation improvements. And this is going to require a lot of cooperation, coordination, and commitment at all levels here, at the local level, regional level, and state level, to ensure that the funding is in place, the plans are in place, and the consensus is there on the approaches that we can take to move forward. So moving specifically into some of the recommendations, I wanted to talk about just a few pieces of this. First, we think that we should be starting immediately identifying workable adaptation options for those sites inundated under the lowest sea level rise scenarios. As you saw in some of those charts before, the time in which those locations are expected to start experiencing more regular inundation is not all that far off. And given the timeframes that are needed to get things like 10-year plan projects done, we need 10 or 15 years of lead time in order to start planning for those. And so those need to start now or very, very soon. This includes addressing High Street, the 101 access to the beach, which again is probably much bigger than a transportation only project, and the Marsh Rd, Parsons Rd area, and at least coming up with plans for how we're going to approach and deal with these roads if they are inundated. We also want to support community efforts to fund projects that enhance coastal resiliency. There's a couple of these that are in the works right now. Newcastle received a grant to do some engineering and hydrology work around the Neil Pitt Lane area, and that will help improve the resiliency of Route 1B in that part of Newcastle. But we want to make sure that, you know, options like that are available, and that the RPC and DOT and the communities are supporting each other's efforts to get these projects implemented and in place and implemented. While they may not have been sort of directly included in our study here, a lot of those local road access points are important for maintaining access to neighborhoods, reducing the flooding impacts, you know, ensuring that their emergency response is available and can get to neighborhoods. And it helps to expand a resilient system that we have in the coast, and really build on what we'll be doing on the state network as well. We need to continue to collect data. We identified adaptation options for slightly less than half of the sites identified, up to 4 feet of sea level rise. So we want to continue our data collection and expand so that we have same level of information for all those 25 sites. We're also missing a lot of volume data on local roads, particularly those low volume locations and roads that are sort of scattered around the region. And we're going to be working towards improving our level of detail in both of those areas. We want to find a way to get towards preliminary engineering at each of the 25 sites that we've identified, and conducting the sort of hydrologic and hydraulic analysis that's needed to really have a good understanding of what can be done at those locations, a better understanding of the pavement structure that is existing at those spots, and how it might be modified to be more resistant to saturation. And we're also going to need to incorporate the work of the hydrodynamic model that I mentioned earlier once that's completed. So those are all recommendations there. Finally, we have some sort of RPC MPO planning type recommendations included in this. One, we need to incorporate the findings of this study directly into our long-range transportation plan, which is a project-specific 20+ year planning document that identifies transportation needs in the region. We have a project selection process that we use to prioritize for that long-range plan, as well as for the state 10-year plan, and we need to incorporate these resiliency factors that we talked about in this study into that process a little bit better. We plan to use our annual work program for transportation to conduct future analyses along these same lines. And we're working to coordinate with NHDOT on project scoping and cost for these areas that are impacted along the coast, and also to work on with them developing a coastal risk tolerance framework for their assets, so that they're looking a little more proactively at where the impacts are going to be along the coast, what that might mean for improvements, but also what it might mean for regular maintenance or maintenance changes over time. So final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of recommendations is that using the information that we had earlier in this document in terms of the level of tolerance for sea level rise, the expected amount of sea level rise at that level of tolerance that we're using for planning purposes, we can come up with basically a time frame for which each of these sites might need to have something in the 10-year plan in order to be in place before the likelihood of inundation increases significantly. And so when we pull all that information together, you can see the orange circles in this graphic kind of show you where we think a project would need to get into the 10-year plan, or sort of by that time frame, in order to be in place prior to seeing regular impacts from inundation. And in some cases, the time period for those projects being into the 10-year plan has already passed. And so this is why we need to start working immediately on trying to address some of those those sites impacted at the lower levels of sea level rise. Finally, just quickly getting into next steps, and then I'll finish up and we can see if there are any questions that people might have. We are wrapping this up rapidly. The project technically concludes today. The report is completed. However, we're working on doing sort of a more kind of professional layout of the document and working on formatting and all that kind of piece of it. We expect that it'll be published around the third week of April. We are working on a couple of newsletter articles to spread the word about the work that's being done here. And we're continuing outreach. I am presenting to Shay in a couple of weeks, the Seabrook Hampton Estuary Alliance in a couple of weeks, as well as the town of Hampton Falls. And we'll be, sort of fielding any other options or opportunities to talk about this project going forward. Beyond this project itself, as I stated earlier, we're looking to integrate the findings from the study into our long-range transportation plan. We're in the process of updating that plan right now. So this is an excellent timing in terms of completing this project. And same for refining our resiliency criteria that we use in our project selection process. We'll be kicking off a project solicitation later this spring and prioritizing projects for the state 10-year plan. So again, this is really good timing to start talking about these types of project needs. We are working with UNH on refining our travel demand model. We're part of their pavement study that their pavement resilience study that they're working on, and we're doing some work to refine our travel demand model as part of that. We're waiting, and it'll be a little bit of a wait because it's just starting to integrate the findings of the state hydrodynamic model once that is complete. And of course, we are always looking for additional grant opportunities to pursue further analysis and design and engineering. The new bipartisan infrastructure law has a couple of potential opportunities for us to get large amounts of funding to do this kind of work through what's called the RAISE program or the PROTECT programs, which focus on improving resiliency of the transportation network. In addition, there are a lot of opportunities out there for communities, the state and regional entities to find some grant funding to undertake some engineering analysis or design or even in construction in some cases. So those will really conclude my comments. If you're looking for more information, feel free to reach out to me. My email is here on the screen. We also have a section on our website that will be being updated with the final work that we're doing now, sort of throughout April. But it gives you the basic information about the project and what we're trying to accomplish. But at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open it up to any questions that folks might have. So let's see. So I'm not seeing that anybody has any questions queued up in either the chat or in the Q&A. I think if somebody had a question and wanted to raise your hand, I can allow you to unmute and we can talk about it.
Kim may have something, Dave. Maybe no.
No, I'm not seeing anything. Okay, no question. All right.
All right.
All right. Well, I'll give it another minute or two in case somebody has a burning question. Otherwise, we'll call it good. And again, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or thoughts on this, or thinking of a way that we might sort of coordinate or work together to continue this work.
Just monitor our website too for the final report. Over the month of April, we'll have a nicely formatted report up there for everyone to take and look and read. And then it looks like Kim McNamara had a.
Okay. So Kim, yes. Question is, did the study take into account evacuation routes? We had initially looked at that, but when we looked at what routes were evacuation routes versus not, pretty much every route that we have in our travel demand model was considered an evacuation route. So this certainly is something that needs to be looked into further, particularly with emergency access issues. But essentially all the roads here are emergency access and evacuation routes. So we, by default, we kind of included them all. All right, well, thank you. I'll be posting this recording up on the website as well, so that folks can come back and listen again, or others that weren't able to see it today can have a listen. Thank you all for your time, and thanks to everybody who participated in this project over the last 2 years. I want to particularly thank the Department of Transportation and the Coastal Program, who I could not have done this without. I visited with a number of the communities to talk specifically about this project and get feedback, and that their time and interest was greatly appreciated as well. So thank you, everyone. Take care.